Almost 1 in 10 chess games will convert down into an endgame involving only rooks and pawns, and that makes these endgames the most common ones to occur in all of chess. And many of these actually have the potential to be simplified down to 1 rook on each side and then a single pawn on the board. There are 2 really important fundamental positions that arise in these kinds of endgames, and I have a bit of an embarrassing confession to make. I didn't actually learn these until quite recently, but these positions are so critical. They drive the strategies and the calculations of more advanced rook and pawn endgames. Even if you're not familiar with these positions, you may have heard their names before. They're called the Philidor Position and the Lucena Position, or some people call it the Lucena Bridge. And basically how it works is if the weak side can reach the Philidor Position, then it's a draw. Whereas if the strong side, the side with the pawn, can reach the Lucena Position, then it's a win. And so a lot of further rook and pawn endgame study really kind of boils down to these fundamental positions, and so it's worthwhile to get to know them quite well for your own games. So why don't we dive in and take a look? So let's start with the Philidor Position. So this is kind of a textbook Philidor position, and in this position, black with correct play should make a draw, even though white has the stronger side, has the pawn. And so here are kind of the characteristics of this position. Notice that the black king is on the 8th rank and standing in front of the white pawn. And also the black rook is on the 6th rank. And what this does is it prevents the strong king from moving forward and supporting this pawn to push any further. The strong pawn is usually here on the 5th rank, and it doesn't really matter too much exactly where the king and the rook are. The most important thing is that this king is standing in front of the pawn and the rook is preventing the strong king from making any progress. These are the defining characteristics of the Philidor position. And so in order to play this correctly, there are just a few rules. So first of all, if white just simply plays sort of a waiting move like this one, what we want to do is we want to keep our rook on the 6th rank so that the king cannot make any progress. And so, simply playing something like rook f6, the rook could go over here. And there will always be like a few squares on the 6th rank that the rook can just move, back and forth to so that the king can never make any progress. So let's just reset. What if instead the rook, the strong rook tries to deliver side checks? Well, now the rule is we just want to keep this king in front of the pawn. So we can just simply move to the 7th rank. And then if we get another check, we move back to the 8th rank. So just always make sure that the king is standing in front of this pawn. And so the more interesting case is what happens if white pushes the pawn. Well, now our strategy is going to shift a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring the rook all the way back. And the goal is we're going to start delivering checks from behind. And the thing is, the king can't actually get away from these checks. It can't hide anywhere. Maybe it could hide all the way back behind this rook, but then it basically, if the king ever steps away from this pawn, then we just attack the pawn. And they can't do anything other than, go back and defend the pawn with the king. If they push the pawn, for example, then we just take it because our king is standing there like right in the way, right? So yeah, once the pawn is pushed, we bring our rook back, we start delivering checks from behind, and there's nothing else that white can do. It's just going to be perpetual check, or we're going to end up winning the pawn. And once we've won the pawn, then it's like, if this happens, then it's just simply a draw. Like white could trade the rooks and it would be just kings, but a king and a rook versus a king and a rook, that is just simply a draw. So that is the Philidor position. And once you get there, it's actually pretty easy to navigate if you just kind of remember these rules and these ways to handle the different things that the strong side can do. So now let's look at the Lucena position. And the Lucena position is a little bit trickier, but the idea is like this is kind of a textbook Lucena position. And in this position, white wins. And so we have a few characteristics here as well. First of all, notice that the pawn is on the 7th rank and the king is standing directly in front of the pawn. That's one of the big things that helps us to see that this is the Lucena position. And often, but not always, this isn't necessary, but often this rook will be cutting off the king from getting out from in front of the pawn, and this king will be cutting off from the other side. So this is kind of a good starting position for understanding the Lucena and the main ideas. The first thing we want to do is we want to deliver a check to this king. And typically the king will move away. Technically the king can move closer, but this doesn't actually work. There are a few different ways we can get to, you know, this kind of position with the king, but in this particular case, we can just simply move our king out here. There's no check from this rook. We're just going to promote this pawn. So, as I said, typically the king will move away. And then kind of the key move here, which is not very intuitive unless you've learned it, is a move like this, where we move the rook onto the 4th rank. And I'll show you why this is the case. Because as I said, if you've never seen this before, this might seem like a pretty strange place for the rook. Like, why would this work? Why would this make this position a win? So let's say the defending rook attacks the pawn or puts pressure on the pawn. Now we can move the king out, defending, you know, covering the promotion square. So we're threatening to promote the pawn. And now, kind of like the Philidor position, the defending side might try to deliver some checks from behind. But here's what happens. We move the king out, we get another check, move the king over here. We can't move like all the way down because then the pawn will hang, right? So we need to keep defending this pawn. But then after this check, we can move the king a little bit further away from the pawn. And once we get a check from the rook, now our rook blocks. And that's the point. That's why the 4th rank works, because we can move the king down here and then get our rook to defend and block these checks just in time. And so this is the whole point. And of course, you know, if rook takes, king takes, now black can't stop that pawn from promoting. A couple other things to just look at. So for example, maybe if we're back in this position, the king, you know, if the rook gives a check and the king wants to come down here, what happens if instead of delivering another check, black just maintains this kind of pressure on this pawn. Now, what we can basically do is, instead of being able to bring the king down here and blocking, what we can essentially do is bring the rook around to block on the 5th rank instead. But there is a little trap. If we were to move the rook here right away, this is a blunder, and it's because rook takes. And now if we take with the king, then we lose our rook and this is a draw. So this is no good. The idea works though, to bring the rook around to here. And so what we need to do is just throw in sort of an intermezzo kind of move where we put this king in check. And then once the king moves out of the way, then we come down here and now the rook can come over and we're going to promote this pawn. So just be careful of a couple of these little tricks, especially this one in the Lucena position. And there's one other thing. If I just go back here to where we've just put our rook on the 4th rank, what if the king, for example, tries to attack the rook like this? Well, now there are a few options, but one of the simplest ones is we can just move over and we're still on the 4th rank, and now we're just supporting the pawn from behind. And so we can, you know, threaten promotion, and then there's a check, and then we can just kind of get out of the checks, get out of the way, and eventually we're going to promote this pawn. So this kind of strategy of attacking the rook once it gets to the 4th rank really doesn't work out for the defending side. So that's really the basics of the Philidor and the Lucena, and I just wanted to show you a quick position here that kind of demonstrates these ideas. So take a second, actually, in this position. Do you think that white can win this position? Can white achieve the Lucena position here? Or is this a draw? Can black get into the Philidor position? Take just a second to try to figure this one out. Once you've taken a second, let's have a look. So white wants to advance the king because white wants to support getting this pawn up. And I guess I'll just say, if you thought that this was a draw for black, I absolutely wouldn't blame you. When I took a look at this, I thought that as well, that black could just draw this position. But in fact, this is a win for white, and we'll see why. It looks like after white advances the king, the rook can just simply move out of the way, and then it would be very tempting to put the king here on e6, because this is starting to look like the Lucena position. We're getting the king in front of the pawn, right? But rook a6, and now the king is in check. The king needs to move out of the way, and this is the Lucena position. Now the rook is on the 6th rank, the king is in front of the pawn, and black draws this position. But white has a better option. So let's go back. I should also mention that advancing the king is better here, because if white advances the pawn, this is also a blunder, because now the king is actually cut off. The king can't move forward and can't provide any support to pushing this pawn further down the board. So we have to advance the king, And then when the rook moves, instead of putting the king in front of the pawn like this, let's just advance the king directly forward like this. And now we're not in the way of this pawn. And at this point, even if black delivers this side check, we can simply push the pawn one more square. And now this kind of looks a little bit like the Philidor position because it looks like, okay, the pawn has advanced. Now we can move the rook behind and start delivering checks from behind, right? But we can't because the king wasn't cut off and the king was able to make it to the 6th rank already. Now this king is in danger of being checkmated. So if we move the rook down here, then this is just checkmate in one move. And so that does not work. Black has to deal with this checkmate threat. And so the best way to do that is to just move the king out of the way. We deliver a check anyway. The king moves here. And now we actually get the white king in front of the pawn. And now this is not quite the Lucena position, but it will be in just a few moves. So the rooks move back. This rook is just kind of staying on the A file because, you know, if the king moves back, we might want to deliver this check. But now the king can just move out of the way and support the promotion of the pawn. If we get a check, then we just go up here and then we push the pawn. And this is the Lucena position, right? After just one move, we can deliver this check to move this king out of the way. And we put our rook on the 4th rank. And Lucena position, we can work on moving our king around and blocking checks with the rook and do exactly what I just showed in the previous position where we talked about the Lucena specifically. So there's definitely a lot more detail that you can get into, but those are the basics of the Philidor and the Lucena positions, which, as I mentioned, are so fundamentally important to these types of rook and pawn endgames. And as I also mentioned, these are the most common endgames in chess. So it's really worth getting to know these positions, practicing them a bit, and quizzing yourself on them, trying to make sure that you know them really well so that if they ever come up in a game or even just kind of in your calculations as you're trying to steer your end game during a chess game, then you'll know these positions and you'll be able to steer the game in the right direction and either get the win if it's possible or get a draw if you can manage to, you know, get into the Philidor even if you're down that pawn. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you can use this in your future games. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.